This is who we are, best friends.
In this sermon series, I've begun each of our sermons with a story. And since this is our last one, you get two. I remember there's a guy I worked with. He was the life of the party. He was hilarious. He was charming. He was thoughtful. Just an all-around joyous guy. And he was one of those guys who just could never seem to get his life on track. You know the type. It was that he would begin to kind of pick up the rubble of his life, and the moment he had a resemblance of something that looked kind of normal, it was almost on schedule, that he would blow it all up and hit restart. And over our time working together, he would always have these moments of crisis where he would come to me and begin to share about his life. And every single time he'd come to me, he'd talk about how he wanted to get right with God again and get back on the right track, etc. And so many times I walked with him through and I talked with him, and we'd leave those, lunch conversations we have together, and he'd be like, yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow Jesus. It's going to happen, right? We're thinking, yes, revival's coming. And then 2 weeks later, he blew up his life again, And one of the last times that I was with him, he went through one of these crises again. And I began to grow very frustrated with him. Like, why do you keep doing this to yourself, right? Like, you are your own worst enemy. And I remember we're sitting in the break room at where we work, and he's just telling me about the mess he's made of his life. And it was almost like a Lifetime movie was following this guy and recording his story, because everything was always so extra. And I use some of the stories of his life as like tales of caution with the young guys that I know. And we're sitting there, and he's just kind of telling me, I wish I could just, get right or whatever. And growing a little frustrated, I said, so what is it, man? Like, what is it that's keeping you from, doing this for real? Like, actually following Jesus. Not having these moments of crisis where we sit here over a burger and you tell me how you want to, but really genuinely change. And as we began to talk, we began to get to the root of things. And the root of things for him was there was a fundamental question at the root of his heart, and it was this: was God enough? You see, with the lifestyle that he had, he knew what he was getting. It was broken, it was lost, but he knew what he was in store for. But what gave him great caution was the unknown of the other side of faith. That if I were to trust in Jesus, would he be enough? Another young guy I was sitting with, we were having a cup of coffee together. And he had been in a season of singleness for some time. And by all measures and metrics, he had done the right thing. He had only ever dated Christians, and he only ever dated Christians the Christian way, right? He had waited and prayed and sought the Lord. And what began in him in the conversation as kind of this posture of sadness or maybe even loneliness quickly grew to frustration. Because he felt as though he had done all the right things, and God was not holding up his end of the bargain. You see, he did it all right. He had, quote unquote, let go and let God, right? He had heard sermon and sermon and sermon about trusting in God's timing. And if he was honest, he was tired of waiting for God's timing because God was quite slow. And so in his frustration and in his hurt, all these emotions poured out of him. And I remember him sitting there quietly for a moment, and then he expressed what was underneath it all. If God never gives me a wife, is he still enough? You see, these questions are nothing new. In the beginning, the way the serpent led Adam and Eve away from faith was with the same question: is God enough? You see, Adam and Eve in the garden were receiving wisdom from God, direction from him. But the serpent came with a question. You too could be like God, and he's holding back on you. So is he enough? Or do you need to take good and evil on your own terms? Do you need to seize wisdom with your own hands? Do you need to take it for yourself? Do you need to only trust in yourself? But here also in Eden, we discover that we were made for relationship with God. That according to Jesus, eternal life is not a never-ending worship service. According to Jesus, eternal life is knowing God. He says this in John chapter 17. He says, now this is eternal life. So Jesus can't be more explicit here when he's given a literal definition of what eternal life means to him. Ready? That they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. According to Jesus, life eternal is knowing him, having relationship with him. You see, each of us feel this longing in our heart to know God because this is what we were created for. You were not created to wander about your life lost, but to be found by the one who made you. We've been having conversations around doubt, deconstruction, and the journey of faith. And in this conversation that we've been having, this is kind of the crescendo of it all. We've addressed those ways of thinking. We've addressed all those different ideas. But here is kind of what it all boils down to is this question, is he enough? I want you to bring into mind a time that you were lost. My wife and I were recently in Portland. And I would say I'm generically pretty good at directions, generically. And what's easy about navigating in New Mexico is there's landmarks, mountains that way, right? And so from there, you can kind of navigate roughly where you are. In Portland, there are no mountains for us to navigate off of. There's just we're in the heart of the city, and there's all these big buildings. And so my wife and I were kind of roaming around, seeing all the things that Portland had to offer, spending way too much on coffee and eating out and things of that nature. And when it's time for us to kind of get back to the hotel, we'd been wandering around for hours, we struggled to find our way back. The way that the city's designed is not that great, but it's like all these series of one-ways, and then everything kind of turns at a slight angle all the time, so there's never like one straight line. You're like always making these turns. And so my wife and I get lost. And so have no fear, GPS is here. But I pull out my phone, and my GPS is getting like turned around. So we'd like be walking like 10 minutes in one direction. It's like, turn around. We're like, what has been going on, And so we're getting lost. And then what kind of starts to creep up is this like low-grade anxiety of like, dude, where are we? How do we get back? I passed that store about 3 times now, right? We're trying to like navigate and look around. Think about a time when you were lost. What kind of rose up in you? What kind of emotions did you have? You see, there's this unsettling feeling of being lost in a place you do not know. Brothers and sisters, the journey of faith can sometimes feel like being lost in a place you do not know. If we were honest, a lot of us feel lost sometimes. We feel lost when what we prayed for felt like it went unanswered. We feel lost when the dreams we had for a career seem to fall apart. We feel lost when the thing that we thought we'd stop struggling with is still a struggle in our lives. We feel lost when we don't have the answers for the hard questions of life. We feel lost when the person we thought we would spend forever with just walked out the door. It is in moments and seasons like this where something in us longs to be found. More specifically, it is moments like this where we find ourselves looking for a God we may or may not believe in. I think of the words of the renowned atheist Julian Barnes, who opened his memoir with the following words: I don't believe in God, but I miss him. As much as secularism and post-Christian culture pervades our moment, there is still something within us that deeply longs to know God. And over the last few weeks, we've been navigating this space of doubt, the space of deconstruction, and having conversations around the journey of faith. And if I could be honest, there's a temptation within me to want to give you certainty, to make it clear, cut, and easy to understand. And too often, we like to run towards things that give us certainty. There's this pastoral longing in me to give you the answers to all of life's hardest questions, if I had them. I assure you, I don't. But even if I did have them, there's that longing to give it to you, but something in us runs towards certainty. Because even if the stories are rooted in myth and misinformation, certainty makes us feel safe. This is why so many people believe in certified conspiracy theories wholeheartedly. Because it's a lot easier to believe a story where there's a clear-cut bad guy or system or evil workers at power than it is to wrestle with the wild uncertainty and chaos of living on planet Earth. It's a lot easier to make up make-believe stories about puppet masters behind the scenes than it is to deal with the fact that we live in a fallen world. And so, even in the church, there is a popular teaching that following Jesus is about certainty. And brothers and sisters, it's not. It's about relationship. All the time throughout the scriptures, Jesus is frustrating to me because he does not give the certainty you look for. They ask him one question, he answers another, right? They ask him, what about this? And Jesus is like, let me tell you a story about this. And that's completely unrelated. Thank you for that. When his disciples are trying to press him and get answers about him, about the time and dates and all this stuff that's going to happen to him, he just completely ignores it and continues on with the things that he wants to talk about. Jesus is frustrating in that way. And what we've tried to do in Journeys of Faith is make formulas of faith, that if you do X, Y, and Z, you can have reassurance of all things in life. But that's just not what the biblical authors teach. The invitation to follow Jesus is an invitation into mystery. It's into relationship, but it's also into mystery. And so, my effort in this sermon series is very clearly not to give you answers, but it's to point you to Jesus and simply say, behold, consider this man. Who might he be? This morning is my strongest effort to do this very thing. And so, brothers and sisters, I would like to invite you this morning not to have your questions answered, but to consider this man Jesus, to behold his heart, and to respond to his words. So here's my goal this morning. My goal is for you to consider this famous story from three perspectives: the younger son, the older son, and the perspective of the Father. Now I realize this story is familiar to many. So I want to ask you this morning to look again with fresh eyes. And I think you might find some things you've missed before. This story comes off a series of stories in which Jesus tells about the way that the kingdom is. The first story Jesus tells in the beginning of Luke 15 is about a sheep that goes lost, and how a shepherd would leave the 99 sheep he has to go and find the one. And Jesus says, this is what the kingdom is like. The second story is about a woman who loses a coin in her house. And so she flips the whole house upside down to find this coin. And when she finds the coin, she throws a massive party because she found the coin. It is supposed to be lavish, unrealistic, kind of insane to do such a thing. And he says, this is what the kingdom is like. And both of these stories are coming off a prompt from the Pharisees, where they accuse Jesus of being friends with sinners. And Jesus says, let me tell you what the kingdom is like. It's like when somebody loses something and throws a massive party because what was lost is now found. This is what the kingdom is like. And then he closes these stories with the third story, which some famous authors have called one of the greatest stories ever written. It is a story about a father and two sons. Now, the first son I want you to think about likes to live life coloring outside the lines. This is who he is. Probably an artistic type, if we'd be honest, right? Rebel, plays against the rules, no authority over me, etc., etc. The older brother is the polar opposite. Rules are his friend. Lists are his people, right? This is kind of what he's about. He's organized. He thinks linearly about things. You do the right thing, you get the right thing, everybody's happy is the way that it kind of works. And these brothers are kind of polar opposites. And we have a father who loves these sons dearly. Now, the story begins with this. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one says to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Now, inheritance works now like it did then. You typically would have to wait for somebody to die to get to your inheritance. And this is an honor-shame culture. It's not the 21st century where he sent this over a text with a GIF, right? This is honor-shame. And so basically what he's telling his dad in so many words is this: "I'm sick of waiting for you to die, old man. Give me my money now." If you're a parent in the room and your child spoke to you in this manner, what would your response be? Right? If they were young enough, painting the back porch red. If they were old enough, at least the tongue lashing. "I brought you into this world, I will take you out of the world," right? But we don't say that as good parents, right? You would be upset, angry, disrespected, to say the least. But what does the father do? He liquidates his assets and he gives his son the cash. Now, if you read any parenting book, right, this is no 101, right? You're enabling bad behavior, right? What is he going to do with that cash? Are you out of your mind? At least a trust fund, right? Whatever it would be. But the son doesn't want relationship with the father anymore. He wants out. And the father honors his son's requests. You see, for the younger son, relationship with dad became more about what he could get from him rather than being with him. He said, "I'd rather have what you can give than who you are. Give me my estate." Now, legally, the father owes the younger son not a dime. He doesn't have to give him anything. Typically, how it works is the eldest would get 2/3 of it, and whatever was left over went to the younger siblings. And so at best, he gets 1/3. Maybe, but the father's not obligated to any of that. He's only obligated to the firstborn. But he does. He honors his son's request. And I could imagine the son just being shocked that it actually worked. Right? "I want my money." "Okay. Really? Right? Like, are you sure?" The father does. And so the process, the way it had to work is the way that they had inheritance was not with just cash on hand, but it was land. And so the father would have to liquidate, sell the land that has been in his family for generations to give his son the money. And so he goes through all that process of real estate and realtors and selling the land to give his son the cash. And it says that not long after that, verse 13, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. So the second-born gets the cash and says, "We're going to Vegas, baby." He goes, he gets an apartment on the Strip, and every night is a party. Drinks on me, everybody. And suddenly he becomes famous and has friends, and there's these elaborate parties, and it feels like the Great Gatsby, you know? He's there, and there's the rapturous parties and having a good time, and don't worry, I got the tab, boom, boom, throwing it down. This money's never gonna end. And it says he squandered, wasted away on wild living. And we could assume what all falls underneath that category of wild living. But notice verse 14. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country. And notice this, and he began to be in need. You see, once all the money was up, there went the friends. There went the reputation. Nobody answered his calls when he asked if he could crash on their couch like they did his. Nobody's there for him anymore. And to make bad situations worse, not only does he not have any money, but the place that he's living goes through a famine. There's a shortage of food. And so even if he had money, there wasn't food to buy. And for the first time in his life, he began to have need. You see, all this time before, the father had always taken care of him. There was always food in the pantry. There was always, the heater was always on or whatever. There was never this worry in him. But suddenly, for the first time in his life, he begins to need. So, verse 15, he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. Now, this is a Jewish young man. Working with pigs is not kosher, but he takes the only job that's available, which is feeding pigs. And when he's feeding them, verse 16 says this, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. But notice this, but no one gave him anything. I don't know how many of you have been around pigs before. They're not really connoisseurs of their diets. Whatever you put in front of a pig, they will eat, good, bad, or ugly, right? And so there's a term called pig slop, and it sounds as delicious, as you might think. It is just this hodgepodge of leftover gunk. It's kind of like your fridge right now with all these Thanksgiving things. If you just mix them all together, is that gravy, chili, mashed potatoes, or turkey? I don't know, but it's all just one thing. And this is what the pigs would eat. But it's not that high quality food. It is basically garbage. And the son is so hungry, he's thinking, I can make a sandwich out of that. I could eat something out of this. But they wouldn't even surrender the slop to him. And notice what the text says next. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. So he's there thinking, look, the guys on my dad's payroll don't have to worry about where food's coming. Maybe if I just go back to him and I tell him how sorry I am and that I've sinned against him and that I've sinned against God, then maybe he would hire me as one of his staff to be able to work so at least I could eat and have a place to lay my head and be taken care of in that way. But I know that because of what I've done, I've disqualified myself to be his son. But possibly I could be his staff. So he gets up and begins to make his way back to the father. And the hardest step for him, I'm sure, was the first step down the driveway, as he's wondering what kind of reception will he come to after what he's done to his dad. But the text says this, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and filled with compassion for him, he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. So the son's at the end of the driveway wondering what kind of reception he's going to get. And his dad's out there and he sees him. And he just sees his dad, they wore dresses back then, hike up the dress. You can see the wide of his thighs, right? And he's booking it down the driveway. Now at first you might be thinking, oh, he's going to come and tear me apart. But the father comes and as he gets close enough to him, instead of striking him, he embraces him. And he begins to kiss his son and welcome him back home. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So he immediately begins to say, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done it, I shouldn't have left. And the father tells his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's feast and have a celebration. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. So the father responds by saying, Son, you have nothing to tell me. I'm just happy you're home. Let's throw a party. And so he gets him the best clothes, the best sandals, and he restores the sonship back to the son. The son said, I don't want to be your son anymore. And when he returns, the father gives him the family name back, saying, you are my son. And he declares to all of his servants that this is his son. And they go and they make ribeye steaks for everybody. That's the kind of party that it is. They kill the fattened calf, which means the really marbled steaks, baby, right? There's no expense too high for this party we're going to celebrate with. There's a story about a woman who lived just outside of Detroit, a couple cities away from Detroit. She grew up in a super conservative family. And so as she was kind of coming of age and wanting to listen to the music she wanted to listen to and do TikTok dances or whatever it is, right? Her parents would be basically against those things and be like, hey, listen, look, that dancing is not glorifying to God. And so they kind of shut down those things. And what began to rise in her was this bitterness and this feeling of being misunderstood. And so later into her teenage years, she meets a boy. And this boy is not acceptable to mom and dad. And so this huge fight ensues. You can't tell me who to love, right? This whole kind of thing. And so after this huge argument erupts between her and her father, she tells her dad, I hate you, and I never want to see you again. Runs off into her room and begins to plan her escape. She's going to run away. Now, you would think she would go to a place like New York or LA, these large cities that could kind of house her and have this place for opportunity. But instead, in her mind, she says, I'm going to go to Detroit because my parents will never look for me there because Detroit's such a rough city to live in. So she catches a bus and she arrives in Detroit, and there she meets a man with a really nice car, big stack of cash, who promises, I can take care of you. And for the first few months, it's great. Buying her all the things that she wants, taking care of every one of her needs. But as you could only imagine, as time goes on, that man introduces her to heroin. And she begins to become addicted. And it gets to this place where her addiction is so bad that she begins to sell herself for her fix. And so quickly, she has no idea the kind of person she's becoming. She does not recognize herself in the mirror. Well, as time goes by, she contracts an STD. And when the man who had been taking care of her finds out, she is no longer good to him and pushes her out onto the streets. And this young woman finds herself sleeping in front of department stores. And as Christmas is approaching, she's awoken by the bells of the Salvation Army out there taking donations. And as she sees this man standing in front of the Walmart, ringing the bell, she's reminded of her family, the conservative background she came from. And suddenly the thought enters her mind, what would it be like for me to go home? How nice it would be just to be back. So she gets herself to a phone and she calls her parents. She calls and no answer. So frantically she calls again. And again, no answer. And so this third time, in a plea of desperation, she calls. This will be the last time. And when she calls, they don't answer. But she decides to leave a voicemail. She says, look, I'm going to be taking a bus through town. It's me, your daughter. I want to come home. And so if you'll have me, I'll be at the bus stop at this time. There's about a 15-minute window. And if you would have me, would you meet me there? And if you don't show up, I'll understand. But I'm going to move to Canada and try to start a new life. So she gets on the bus. And on the way to the bus, she instantly becomes self-conscious about her appearance. You see, she's not the girl she was when she left. She bears the scars of the streets. She has nicotine underneath her fingernails and scars in her arms for the drugs she's taken. And she knows her appearance is not what it used to be. And so she begins to worry, what might my parents think when they see me? And so having not heard back from her parents for she borrowed the phone, she arrives into her city. And she peeks out the window and she doesn't see her parents. So she reasons in her mind and says, you know what I'll do is I'll just get down and take one lap. And if I see them, great, and if not, I know. And so she steps off the bus, and she walks to the doors of the bus depot, and she sees banners draped all about. And there's like 40 people in the room, and they're all wearing party hats and have this decor and celebration. And she's confused, and then suddenly she sees her dad. And she can finally comprehend the banner. The banner has her name. And when she sees her dad, she breaks out in tears and runs towards him and begins to tell him of the places she's been and the things she's done. Before she could even get a word out, the dad says, "Shh, you don't have to tell me. You're home now." And there in a bus depot outside the city of Detroit, the kingdom of God came. A prodigal was welcomed home. This is the heart of the kingdom. There are those of you in this room who believe you're too far gone. Your story is too broken. Your past too flawed. Your heart too prone to wander. And the story of the younger son is that this: you can always come home. The heart of the Father is not an angry father standing at the end of the driveway saying, "Where have you been?" But it is an image of a loving father with arms wide open saying, "Welcome home. I don't need to know where you've been. I don't need to know what you've done. I'm just happy that you're here." And the response is this overwhelming celebration that one child who was once lost is now found. Now, this is where most sermons end. And we build to this big crescendo, the band comes up, and you can come home. We do it all. And if I were a good preacher, I'd stop there. But this is not where Jesus ends the story. You see, because there's another son. Notice what happens next. It says, "Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, working. And when he came to the house, he heard music and dancing. And so he called one of the servants and said, 'What is going on?' The servant replies, 'Your brother has come home. Your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' And the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered the father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. And when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything that I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" You see, this older brother had did everything by the book. He obeyed everything. He stayed when everybody else left. He was committed to helping the family business, continuing to make it successful. And his brother went and ruined his life. And when he comes back, this is the way you welcome him back. Do you not know how hard I've been working? The things I've had to be through, that we've lost half of the property because of his way of living, and I've been trying to hold on to the little bit we have left, and this is the way you welcome him back? He becomes angry. And notice the way that he speaks to his father. First, he doesn't even address him as father. He just starts in saying, "Look." And he considers himself a slave. He says, "I've been slaving for you. Not for the family business, not for the place that we live, but for you." He says, "And you didn't even throw but a small party for me." He is wounded. He is hurt. Now, when the father would have divided the property, he would have given both sons their inheritance. Because in dividing the property and giving it to the younger son, he would be held to give it to the older son. And so the father is now living kind of on the older son's property. Even though it was the father's, he's given it to the son. And so when the father kills the fatted calf and does all this other stuff. He's actually spending the son's things. And this is why the son has this posture towards him. You're wasting my things on him. Now notice, both brothers have the same posture towards their father. They care less about relationship and more about the things the father can provide for them. Both of them are talking in terms of dollars and cents and not about relationship with the father. And so he has this posture towards him of bitterness and resentment and anger. So when the father tells him, all these things I have are yours, it's literally true. Everything that's in their possession is now belongs to the older son. But he urges to the son the necessity to throw this lavish party for the younger son because he was dead and now is alive, was lost and now is found. And this is where the parable ends. We don't see that the brother repents and says, you're so right, I'm so sorry, let's throw the party. He's still angry outside. Now, the last perspective I want to draw your attention to is that of the father. I want you to put yourself in his shoes. You see, notice the father goes out to both of his sons. One coming back from wild living, and the other one trapped in self-righteousness outside the home. The father leaves for both sons. He leaves the safety of the home to meet with both of his kiddos. And the father pleads with, bargains with, convinces both sons to try and come back and restore this home to be one again. In both stories, the father initiates his love. And in both stories, the father spares no expense for either son. Now, I've entitled the series Prodigal. And when we think about that idea of being prodigal, we think about somebody who's wandered off or is quote-unquote lost. But that's not what prodigal means. Prodigal means to spend money or resources freely and recklessly, wastefully extravagant, having or giving something in lavish scale. In a few words, prodigal means radically generous. And for years, this story has been known as the story of the prodigal son. But the prodigal one here is the father, because he spares no expense for his kids. He is willing to lose it all for them. And in this story, Jesus is the father. The pagans are the sons who go off and squander their inheritance. And the Pharisees are the ones who are self-righteous, complaining about them coming home. You see, remember how all of this started was with the Pharisees complaining that Jesus was a friend of sinners. And Jesus goes on to explain the kind of kingdom that he leads is one that welcomes those who are lost. Brothers and sisters, it's this. There is more than one way to be lost. According to Jesus, both the Pharisees and the pagans are both lost. For different reasons and in different places, but both are lost. I've been talking about in this series that doubt and deconstruction and the journey of faith are not primarily intellectual or theological, but it's fundamentally relational. And I posed a question in the beginning, is this question of, is God enough? And I lay before you this story. That Jesus was willing to give everything to seek and save the lost. When we started this church, our heart, our desire was to reach the city with the message of Jesus. But God gave us a specific assignment. He told Jake and myself and our families very clearly in the beginning that our specific assignment we're to reach two categories of people. One, people who are far from Jesus, and two, people who are burnt out on religion. This was our clear and specific assignment. And since starting this church, we've seen Jesus do exactly that. We've seen people who are far from Jesus come to know him and have a relationship with him. And we've seen people who are ready to give up on Jesus and the church altogether come to this church as a Hail Mary, hoping they would find him here. And we've seen God do that very thing because this is his heart. And so I have this sense that God right now is wooing you to himself. You see, in the journey of faith, it is easy for us to allow other things to get in the way. It is easy for us to be like the sons who come to God for the gifts he gives, not who he is. And I spoke to those in the room this morning who feel lost. For some of you, it looks like you're lost in sin. You've been drinking from the cup of the world, hoping that it will satisfy your needs, and you've come here thirsty. You've hoped that the life of the party and that pursuing those things would bring you joy, but deep down you feel deep dissatisfaction. And you long to have that need filled. And the same way the son longed to fill his stomach with some sort of substance, because all of these pursuits never satisfied. And for some people, that's you. You've come weary and worn of sin, and you're looking for a better way. And the invitation of Jesus is come. Come all you weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And when you come, there is no guilt or shame or condemnation. Brothers and sisters, there's a celebration. But there's another type sitting in the room who is not the younger son, but who's the older. And maybe if you're honest, you've come here this morning angry at God because he hasn't done the things you thought he'd do. You resonate with the second story I opened up with, where you felt like you've done all the right things and God's not holding up his end of the bargain. You feel that though you've been in the house, you've been relationally distant from him. And you stand outside the same as the older son with arms crossed, trapped in your own self-righteousness. According to Jesus, you too are lost. And the invitation for you is to come to the party. Is that the Father is willing to lavishly expend on you as well. He's willing to leave the joy of the party to come meet you where you are today. But for you also, it's become more about the gift than the giver. For you lately, your relationship with Jesus is more about just him meeting your needs and giving you a better life than you enjoying him forever. It's become more about you getting the vision that you had for your life, the dreams, the careers, the plans, all those things in order. And Jesus is just supposed to help those things come to fruition, not surrendering all to him and all to him you owe. And it is this morning the Father's love that is pursuing you. And all my time following Jesus, one of the things that always amazes me is the relentless pursuit of God's love. That when we are the younger son, expending ourselves into sin, the Father is eagerly expecting our return. And when we are the older son, pouting in self-righteousness, the Father comes to plead with us to come back to the home. I believe it's Spurgeon who famously called Jesus the hound of heaven because he so relentlessly pursues. And so, this doesn't answer all your questions. You still might have some. You still might wrestle. You still might struggle. But the journey of faith, there's a promise that wherever it is you are, the Lord journeys with you. And he always invites you into his love. And so I'm going to ask the worship team to come up. And we want to enter into a time of response where we just consider the story of Jesus. And as was my initial attention, was just to lay before you this man and his heart, and for you to respond to him. Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you for what you're doing in the room this morning. Thank you that you are the Father who relentlessly pursues your people. Thank you for your reckless love, your prodigal love that does not hold back an expense and celebrating the return of your kids. Thank you, Jesus, for this word. Amen.
See